Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about the standings. Now, what I've got on the left-hand side of the board here is where the standings were in the NHL at Christmas. What I've got over here is where the standings are right now, understanding that the Christmas break's still a few days away. There's some games that will decide where these teams all end up, so I've got other teams on the board here too. But it's interesting to note that teams that are playoff teams at Christmas are normally playoff teams in April because we're almost halfway through the season. A lot of the good teams we already know are going to be good teams. So last year at this time, last year at Christmas, Boston had played 33 games, 56 points. By the time we reach Christmas, they'll have played 32 games. Right now they have 44 points in 30 games. So it's quite the drop off from last year, but we knew that. And yet they're still first in their division. Oddly enough, last year they were 8 points ahead of second place. This year they're 6 points ahead of second place because Toronto's fallen off a bit as well. Last year, at the Christmas break, they had 48 points in 34 games. This year, in 29 games, they have 38. So they have fallen off from last year's numbers, but they're still second in the division. So Boston and Toronto stays in the same spot. And of course, last year they finished first and second. One of the problems that we had last year was the top three in the Atlantic were set by Christmas. Tampa Bay being that third place team. And there really wasn't much chance of Florida catching them, and Florida didn't. Although it did get a lot closer by the end of the season. They didn't catch them. But yeah, 98 points at the end of the season for Tampa. But at this point, well, again, at Christmas, 32 games, 41 points. Interestingly enough, they're currently 1 point out of the playoffs. As where things stand right now, Tampa Bay would not be a playoff team if the playoffs started today. So then we get out to the Metro Division, and Carolina, 50 points. 34 games played. This year they've played 32. They've got 37 points in 32 games. So they're well off of last year's numbers. Last year, of course, they ended first with 113 points. Second last year was New Jersey, 46 points in 34 games. This year they're 2 points below the playoff line right now. They did end up second with 112 points. So same problem in the Metro, almost in the first top two teams were basically the top two teams all year. The difference being that Carolina and New Jersey would swap who was first here and there was still some excitement there. Now, we'll get over to the teams that are currently 1 through 3 in the Metro, but they're not the same teams that were 1 through 3 at the break. Pittsburgh, 33 games, 43 points last year. They ended up missing the playoffs, of course, with 91 points. This year, they're not amongst these three teams here that I've highlighted that are below the playoff line. So Pittsburgh has some teams to jump over. They have to start playing better. And after missing the playoffs last year, did they miss this year? We're going to find out. Your wild card, number one wild card last year was the New York Rangers, 43 points in 35 games. They ended up third in the division with 107 points. So, yeah, they did pass Pittsburgh. Oddly enough, Pittsburgh had 2 games in hand on the Rangers. So when people say, well, this team has games in hand, so clearly they're the better team, not necessarily. You have to win those games in hand. Now, of course, this year the Rangers have 45 points in 30 games. They have games against Edmonton and Buffalo before things wrap up and you go home for Christmas, but those look like winnable games. So would I be surprised if the Rangers win both? Not really, although they're on back-to-backs, so we'll see. But yeah, so the Rangers playing better this year than last year. And for Washington, last year in 36 games, 42 points. They ended up missing the playoffs, of course, this year. In 29 games, they've got 36 points. So a lot fewer games played, and the points totals, not that far off of last year. They're the number 2 wild card this year, the same as they were last year. Now, of course, below the playoff line, you've got the New York Islanders, who had 40 points in 35 games. They ended up the number 1 wild card with 93 points. This year, they have 39 points in 32 games, and they're the number 3 team in the Metro. Florida had 34 points in 35 games at the Christmas break last year. They ended up the number 2 wild card with 92 points. And they had a great run at the end of the season. This year, they have 38 points in 31 games. So while Florida's had their downbeats recently, honestly, they did quite well last year, even though they were below 500 at the Christmas break. So I don't think there's any reason for any concern around Florida, even though that road trip wasn't easy for them. And then you got the Flyers, 39 points in 31 games. They've got a couple of more games before the break, but yeah, Philadelphia was not on the radar last year, and now they are. Detroit, 2 points out of a playoff spot. They stayed close to a playoff spot for a lot of last season, close enough that when they sold at the deadline, there were some that were disappointed that they didn't go for it. And for Detroit this year, it does feel like there's still some progression there. It feels like it's very incremental. And so if you're a fan saying I wish this rebuild would finish a little quicker, I don't think you're alone in the fan base. So that's the East. I'm just looking this over. I don't think there's anything I've missed. I'll go through who's left to play who. Boston's playing at Winnipeg and at Minnesota, so those are both going to be difficult. Minnesota's beating them, and Winnipeg is very tough at home. Toronto is at Buffalo and at Columbus. Those are both games they should win, but, right? One thing to keep in mind is as we get closer to Christmas, and I think we've already seen some of this week, there are teams that, yeah, they're not 100% in it. Their head's not in it. They're already thinking about Christmas, New Year's, and travel. And former players have said this, too, when we get close to Christmas, that this is something that does weigh on your mind, and it's there. And so it's hard to put that out of mind. For Florida, they're at home against St. Louis and Vegas. So St. Louis, that looks like a winnable game, and I'm saying looks like because we know anybody can beat anybody any given night. And then Vegas, of course, won't be easy. The Rangers first, they're at home against Edmonton and Buffalo. As I said, those are both games that should be winnable. Philadelphia Flyers are at home against Nashville tonight, and then they go and play in Detroit. The New York Islanders just have one game left before the break. That is at Carolina. Carolina themselves have two games. First, they're at Pittsburgh, and then they're at home against the New York Islanders. So the Islanders will have rest as a weapon against the Carolina Hurricanes. Washington is at Columbus, and then they're at home against Tampa. Again, both of those are winnable games. So it will be interesting to see how this all plays out when all those games have been done. But again, once we get into Christmas break, I'm not sure yet what I'm posting on the 24th, 25th, 26th, other than the live stream on the 25th. I haven't really decided yet. All right. So we go out west, and Dallas led the division at this point at Christmas last year. 46 points in 35 games. They ended up second in the division with 108 points. 1 point out of first. And this year they have 40 points in 30 games. So they're not really off of last year's pace at all. They're 10 games above 500. They were 11 games above 500 prior to that. It's a good way to remember if you're kind of like, if you're a newer fan and the whole 500 thing throws you off, it's just points minus games. That's how many games over or below 500 you are. So 46 minus 35, you're 11 games over 500. 40 minus 32, you're 8 games above 500. 40 minus 30, 10 games, that kind of thing. So anyways, Dallas is at a similar spot they were last year. Interestingly enough, so is Winnipeg. Winnipeg at Christmas last year had 43 points in 34 games, and then they weren't great down the stretch. They ended up being the number 2 wild card with 95 points in a race for a wild card spot that nobody seemed to really want. This year they have 41 points in 31 games. The only game they have left to play is against Boston, so they'll have 32 games played. They could end up with 43 points. So they could have the same number of points in fewer games, and the fact that Winnipeg's first is kind of fun. Colorado was third last year, they're third this year, and it's the same number of points and games right now that they had last year at Christmas. They have 2 more games, though. So, and I'll go through this too. With Dallas is at home against Vancouver tonight, and then they go and play in Nashville. For Colorado, they're at home against Ottawa and Arizona. Again, are those winnable games? Yes. But is this a team that just lost against Chicago? Also, yes. So for Colorado, what's interesting is they ended the season first with 109 points. But yeah, there were plenty of questions about Colorado and cup hangovers a year ago, and then they got it together. Colorado this year could end up being the same story, and they're in the same spot. They are only 1 point back of first. Last year they were 6 points back of first, so it's even less ground for them to make up. Then we get to the Pacific. So last year, Vegas, who ended up finishing first, 49 points in 36 games. This year, 47 points in 33 games. So similar, if not better this year than they were last year. They ended up first with 111 points in the division. They have Tampa Bay and Florida left before the Christmas break. Those are both road games. So those aren't going to be easy. But if they end up with, say, 49 points in 35 games, let's say they win 1 out of the 2, it's almost the exact same number they had last year. I like the consistency. LA was second this time at Christmas last year. 37 games, 44 points. Lots of games played, right? They ended up third with 104 points. This year they have 40 points in 29 games. So their points percentage is much better this year, keeping in mind they're fantastic on the road and they're not at home. And so that's the big issue with LA, if you qualify that as an issue. but they are currently third in the division. So they would start on the road if the playoffs started today at Vancouver. And again, I know there's games in hand and all that, but they're 4 games back. They have 4 games in hand on Vancouver, but now they're 6 points back of Vancouver. So while yes, the points percentage is mildly better, I would think. Although at that point, I'm not sure. Yeah. Anyways, Seattle was third. They ended up finishing as the first wild card last year, but they were third at this point at Christmas last year. 40 points in 32 games, so the same number as Colorado last year and this year. They ended up with 100 points. This year, they're 3 points out of a playoff spot, and they've played a lot more games than some of the teams they're chasing. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't catch them. It just makes it more difficult. Your number one wild card at this time last year was Minnesota, and I'm just going to put it that way, even though I mean at Christmas, right? 40 points in 33 games, so the same number of points as Colorado, just one extra game. They ended up third with 103 points. They faded down the stretch, too. Minnesota, not on the board, so that's troubling, right? Calgary, 39 points in 35 games. They would end up missing the playoffs with 93 points. This year, they are 3 points back of a playoff spot. So they are on pace to miss the playoffs again. But, it's a young season. We can say all these wonderful things, but the reality is that if you stay 3 points back for much longer, it just gets that much more difficult. Now, the Oilers were outside of the playoff spot by 1 point at this time at Christmas last year with 38 points in 35 games. They ended up second in the division with 109 points. So really strong run after Christmas by the Oilers. They're going to need to be at least that good after Christmas this year if they're going to make the playoffs, if not better. And so while there was a lot of optimism around the Oilers a week ago, now that's kind of dropped off a bit. They are not on the board here. It's odd. It's unusual not to see the Oilers at least in the picture. But right now, they're too far back for me to justify putting them on the board. I think they're 7 points out of the playoffs. So Vancouver stands out because they're nowhere near this board, and they have 46 points in 33 games right now, a remarkable total. So 13 games above 500. If they end up staying 13 games above 500, that's 95 points. Should be a playoff team. So they don't have to play great to make the playoffs from here. They just have to be good. And the fact that they're second in the division, to me, is kind of crazy. They're at Dallas tonight, and then they finish out things at home against San Jose before we hit the break. Then you've got the LA Kings being third, and they have the 1 game at home against Calgary before they hit the break. Nashville's the number 1 wild card. They're not on this side of the board. They did end up pulling themselves to really close to a playoff spot by the end of last season. They have 36 points in 32 games. They're at Philadelphia, and then they're at home against Dallas. So one thing to keep in mind is that the West has looked weaker than the East both last year at Christmas, and this year it does as well. And then in the end, we get a Stanley Cup champion out of the West, both in 2023 and 2022. So you just never know. But yeah, so for the Nashville Predators, they're at Philly, they're home against Dallas. And Nashville is a very, very good team. They're coming off a loss against Vancouver, sure, but they're still playing really well right now. And then you got Arizona. It's been a great story. 34 points in 31 games. They have 2 road games before the break. They go to San Jose. They go to Colorado as well. So Arizona, a team that's showing that they shouldn't be taken lightly, but they might be the team that people pick that ends up falling out. Now, St. Louis is 3 points out of the playoffs. This is why you make the coaching change. Seattle's 3 points out of the playoffs, and they've played a lot more games than other teams are chasing. But for Seattle, there's still that chance, right? Decord was great last night. They end up getting that big win in LA. And again, for Seattle, it's just a 3-point difference. So it's a matter of playing well enough, I would say, to get yourself to, I'll say, 8 to 10 games above 500. Probably cuts it in the West this coming year. I would say 90, 92 points, sure. So you have to figure out how many points a team has to get, what kind of win rate they have to get if they're going to get to that total. It does feel like it may end up being less points to make the playoffs in the West than in the East, but these are close. It's only a 2-point difference between the number 2 wildcard Capitals and the number 2 wildcard Coyotes. The one big difference could very well end up being that teams below the playoff line in the East could end up being better than that number 2 wildcard in the West. There's the possibility that at least 1 or 2 teams missed the playoffs in one conference or the other that might have made it in the other conference. But that already happened last year too. Last year we saw a situation where the Flames missed the playoffs with 93 points. Florida made the playoffs with 92. And then they went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. So that was unusual. We'll see if that kind of thing happens again. So which team do you think ends up dropping out of the playoffs who currently occupies the spot? And which team, let's just put it this way. So the Oilers are an obvious pick if you're going to pick a team that's not on the board that could end up, charging up and getting themselves a playoff spot. What about Pittsburgh in the East? Or do you think, no, those teams are done, they're washed? Let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And hey, I just thought this would be fun because we're getting close to the Christmas break and looking at last Christmas break, comparing it to where we are right now as we head towards the break. But let me know your thoughts on the overall consistency, too. I want to say this, too, in closing. It does feel like there's more uncertainty about who's going to finish where right now than there was last year. Last year, the East was not as exciting the second half of the season. And it definitely, when the games don't necessarily mean a lot because the standings are already kind of decided, it's not as entertaining to watch the game. So I think this just makes it better. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.